Buried in the engineering records of the Historic American Building Survey, in the dry, technical language of construction reports and site assessments, there is a detail so quietly placed that most readers pass over it without stopping. The stone walls of Curated, the grand terraces, the heavy classical facade, the retaining walls that hold the hillside in its manicured shape, were not imported. They were not shipped from some European quarry to lend the house an air of ancient legitimacy. They were cut from the hill they stand on. Workers blasted and quarried the summit of Pocantico Hills itself, tearing out the rock beneath what would become the mansion's foundations, stacking what they extracted into the walls that now frame the view. What was removed from the earth became the earth's new face. That single fact tells you almost everything about how Curated was built and what it was designed to hide. In the summer of 1893, a series of real estate transactions moved quietly through Westchester County. 9 parcels, roughly 404 acres, approximately $397,000 changing hands across a few months. The buyer's name did not appear prominently in the negotiations. Agents handled the purchases. Small landowners, farmers, families who had worked this stretch of the lower Hudson Valley for generations sold their parcels individually, without knowing who was assembling them, without understanding that their separate decisions were pieces of a single deliberate plan. The buyer was John D. Rockefeller Sr. By 1893, Rockefeller was not merely wealthy. He was the wealthiest private individual in American history in the making, the founder and architect of Standard Oil, a company that by that point controlled the vast majority of oil refining in the United States. He was also, and he understood this clearly, the most publicly distrusted businessman in America. Ida Tarbell had not yet published her 19-part exposé in McClure's magazine. That would come in 1902, but the accusations were already circulating: railroad rebates, price manipulation, the systematic absorption or destruction of every competitor who refused to be bought. He wanted a refuge. He found it on a hilltop above the Tappan Zee in a place called Pocantico Hills, where on a clear day you could see the Hudson River bend south toward Manhattan and the whole valley spread out in a silence the city could not touch. He moved his family into the existing structure on the property, a Gothic-style farmhouse known as the Parsons Wentworth House, which would later be called Curated I, and began, with the quiet efficiency that defined everything he did, to buy more land. The 404 acres of 1893 became the foundation. Over the following years, the consolidation continued: more parcels, more quiet purchases, more families who sold without, knowing the full picture. By the time the process was complete, the Rockefeller estate at Pocantico Hills exceeded 3,000 acres, a private enclosure of an entire landscape, with private roads that appeared on no public map, a controlled environment so complete that to visit required not just an invitation, but admission to a world that operated by different rules than the one outside its borders. In 1895, before a single stone of the grand mansion had been laid, the original wood stables and service buildings near Curated I were destroyed in an arson attack. The message from the local community was not ambiguous. Rockefeller rebuilt in fireproof stone. He also challenged increased local tax assessments in court, won a reduction, and then, in a move that would become characteristic, funded a new school for the Pocantico community. Self-protection and targeted philanthropy delivered in the same gesture. The pattern was already fully formed. What followed was not a single act of construction, but a prolonged argument about what kind of place Curated should be, an argument that consumed more than a decade and produced not one house but 3. Curated I burned in September 1902. Faulty electrical wiring, the kind Rockefeller had already ordered replaced. The loss was estimated at $40,000. The family moved into the smaller Kent house on the property while a decision was made about what came next. That decision exposed a fault line running through the entire project. Rockefeller Sr. wanted simplicity. He was, genuinely and not merely for appearances, a man who found ostentatious display distasteful. His Baptist convictions were real. His frugality was real. He wanted a house that was, in his own framing, simple and dignified. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was increasingly managing the project, wanted something different, a house commensurate with the family's position, something that would stand alongside the great houses of the American and European elite, something that would make the argument in stone and formal gardens that the Rockefellers belonged not just to the world of industry but to the world of culture. They hired Delano and Aldrich, Beaux-Arts trained architects whose initial design evolved into an eclectic structure of Georgian inspiration shading toward continental grandeur. Construction of what became Curated began in 1906 under the Thomson-Starrett Company. By spring of 1908, Rockefeller had spent nearly $1 million on new structures and improvements at Pocantico, not including land acquisition costs. The coach barn alone, initially estimated at $70,000, ultimately came in at more than $135,000. The family moved into Curated II. Rockefeller Sr. found it unsatisfactory, too dark, awkward, not aligned with his sense of how a family ought to live. In 1910 and 1911, plans were drawn for major alterations. Delano and Aldrich were recalled. The top floors were removed. A new story was constructed. The main facade was relocated forward. New skylights were installed. The plumbing, heating, and electrical systems were substantially upgraded. And a delivery tunnel was cut beneath the terraces so that the movement of goods, the logistics of running a large household, could take place entirely below the level of the family's visual world. What emerged from this radical reconstruction, completed in 1913, more than a decade after the 1902 fire, was called Curated III. It is the house that stands today. The architects chosen were not merely builders. Ogden Codman Jr., the society decorator who had co-authored The Decoration of Houses with Edith Wharton, selected interior furnishings from London, Paris, New York, and Boston. William Wells Bosworth designed the formal gardens, terraces, the tea house, and the orangerie, a dedicated structure built to overwinter imported ornamental orange trees from France. Lord and Burnham constructed the greenhouses. Tiffany Studios contributed bronze work. The American Bridge Company provided structural steel. Every choice made the same argument. This is not new money pretending to be old money. This is culture. This is permanence. This is what a family that has always belonged here looks like. The Rockefellers finally moved into Curated III in 1913. The mansion standing on that hilltop above the Tappan Zee was the product of 3 houses, 2 architects, 1 catastrophic fire, a decade of disagreements between a father and a son, a delivery tunnel invisible from above, and the labor of immigrant masons who had come to Westchester County for the new Croton Aqueduct and stayed to cut stone for a family that preferred not to see them work. The stone in the walls came from the hill beneath. Them. The hill was excavated to build the house that now sits on it. What was taken away became, in the end, the place itself. Before we can understand that house fully, we need to understand the fortune that paid for every stone of it, and what that fortune actually cost. In 1913, the year the Rockefeller family finally moved into Curated III, John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s personal fortune stood at roughly $900 million. That same year, the entire federal budget of the United States was approximately $700 million. One man's accumulated wealth exceeded what the American government spent running the country for a full year. The question Curated asks you, without ever saying it aloud, is simple. What does that number look like when you decide to turn it into stone? The Standard Oil story begins in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1860s. with a young Asana bookkeeper, a chaotic new industry, and a method that would define American capitalism for generations. Oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. Within a few years, hundreds of small producers and refiners were competing frantically across the region, prices swinging wildly, no central order, no dominant player. Rockefeller entered this chaos in his early 20s and saw not disorder, but opportunity. His insight was not technical. He was not an engineer or a geologist. His insight was organizational, that the real money in oil was not in finding it, but in controlling what happened to it afterward. Refining, transportation, distribution, the infrastructure that everyone needed and nobody yet owned. In 1870, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio was formally incorporated. Over the next decade, Rockefeller executed one of the most systematic consolidations in business history. The method was straightforward in principle and brutal in practice. First, negotiate secret rebates from railroad companies, discounted rates for shipping Standard Oil's product, while competitors paid full price. Then, when a competitor found itself financially struggling against that structural disadvantage, offer to buy it out, often at far below its actual value, because by that point the owner had no alternatives. If a competitor refused, launch a price war and sustain losses until the competitor collapsed. Then restore standard pricing in that market and move on to the next one. Competitors called it the anaconda method. Squeeze until nothing is left. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of American oil refining. In 1882, Rockefeller created the Standard Oil Trust, a legal structure allowing multiple nominally separate companies to operate under a single centralized board. It was a corporate innovation and a regulatory loophole simultaneously, and it gave Rockefeller control at a scale American law had not yet figured out how to address. The public reaction was not slow in coming. Through the 1880s and 1890s, editorial pages, congressional investigations, and political speeches positioned Standard Oil as the defining example of what unchecked industrial power looked like. Cartoons depicted Rockefeller as a giant octopus, its tentacles wrapped around oil derricks, railroads, government buildings, and newspapers. The image was not entirely accurate. It was not entirely inaccurate either. Then, in 1902, Ida Tarbell began publishing. Her 19-part series in McClure's magazine collected into a 2-volume book in 1904 under the title The History of the Standard Oil Company is American investigative journalism's founding document. Tarbell was not a detached observer. Her father had been an independent oil producer financially ruined by Standard Oil's competitive pressure. Her reporting was personal and it was precise. She cited documents. She interviewed former employees. She tracked railroad rebate records through public filings. She did what reporters of her era rarely did. She proved it. The portrait her reporting constructed, a corporation that systematically destroyed competitors, influenced legislators, and charged monopoly prices to ordinary Americans, attached itself to Rockefeller's name permanently. And Kikuit's construction was happening in exactly this period. Kikuit II's construction began in 1906. Tarbell's book was published in 1904. The family was building a house designed to project simplicity and dignity while the most thorough public accounting of how their money was made was being read across the country. That timing was not coincidence, it was context. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered the company broken into 34 separate entities. The government believed this would damage Rockefeller financially. It did not. The 34 successor companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which later became Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil, Standard of Indiana, which became Amoco, among others, all carried Rockefeller's shareholdings. When these companies began trading independently on the open market, Their combined value exceeded what the unified Standard Oil had been worth. The breakup, intended as punishment, functioned as a windfall. By 1913, his fortune stood at approximately $900 million, roughly 3% of U.S. GDP. Modern economists and historians have attempted various calculations of what this translates to in today's money, producing figures ranging from $45 million to several hundred billion depending on whether simple inflation, wage comparisons, or GDP ratios are used. The precise figure matters less than the scale. He was, by most measures, the wealthiest private individual who had ever lived up to that point in history. Against that number, the cost of Kaikwit becomes something worth sitting with. By spring of 1908, Rockefeller had spent nearly $1 million on new structures and improvements at Pocantico, not counting land. The coach barn alone exceeded $135,000. The subsequent reconstruction of Kaikwit II into Kaikwit III added further millions. And yet, against a fortune of $900 million, $1 million represented approximately 1/10 of 1% of his total wealth. If you earn $100,000 a year, the proportional equivalent is $100. A dinner out, a few books, a number so small it barely registers as a decision. This is the financial reality inside which Kaikwit was built. Not a strain, not a sacrifice. A rounding error dressed in Beaux-Arts stone. Yet the money alone does not explain the anxiety that runs through every design decision, every rebuild, every careful choice of architect and decorator and landscape designer. Rockefeller Sr. was genuinely frugal. This is documented, confirmed by family members, visible in the personal account ledger he kept from his teenage years through the end of his life, recording every income and expenditure with the precision of a man who believed that stewardship mattered regardless of scale. He tithed from his first salary. He was a devout Baptist. He did not drink. He found ostentatious display genuinely distasteful, not as a pose but as a conviction. The problem was structural. A man who genuinely wanted simplicity had assembled a fortune so large that simplicity had become architecturally impossible. You cannot spend $900 million on simplicity. Simplicity, at that scale, requires its own elaborate infrastructure, architects hired to make grandeur look restrained, decorators sourced from London and Paris to project inherited taste rather than purchased taste, gardens designed by the finest landscape architects in the country to suggest that nature had simply arranged itself this way. The fortune that built Kaikwit was made through a system of control so complete that it reshaped an entire American industry. What Kaikwit attempted, in its stone, its terraces, its carefully chosen interiors, was a conversion, not of money into property, but of contested wealth into something that looked, from the right angle, like it had always been there. Whether that conversion succeeded is a question the house itself cannot answer. What it can tell you is what it cost to attempt it and who paid. The Historic American Building Survey is not the kind of document that reaches for drama. It is a government record, methodical, technical, concerned with materials and dimensions and construction phases. It does not editorialize. It does not pause to consider implications. It simply states what it found. Which is what makes one particular line so difficult to move past. In its documentation of the Kaikwit greenhouse complex, the survey notes that in the first half of the 20th century, the property employed hundreds of workers to maintain the grounds and to produce food and flowers for the Rockefeller family. Not dozens, hundreds. A workforce the size of a small factory, sustained year after year for the domestic comfort of a single household. The report offers this information without emphasis, without commentary, as if it is the most ordinary fact in the world. Perhaps in 1900 it was. The labor story at Kaikouet begins before the Giitsazi mansion itself does, in the quarries and road cuts of Westchester County in the 1890s, where the first wave of workers arrived not for the Rockefellers but for the new Croton Aqueduct. The aqueduct was a massive public works project supplying fresh water to New York City. It required skilled stone workers in large numbers, and it drew them primarily from Italy, men who had grown up working with stone, who understood how to read rock formations and shape them to purpose, whose hands carried knowledge accumulated across generations of masonry tradition. They came for the aqueduct. When that work wound down, they were in Westchester County, available, skilled, and looking for the next contract. Rockefeller's estate management hired them. This is how the walls of Kaikouet were built, by Italian immigrant masons whose original destination was a public water system, who ended up instead cutting and stacking the stone of a private estate. Their names do not appear in the guided tour. Their wages are not in the public record. What remains of them is the work itself. The precisely fitted ashlar granite of the house facade, the retaining walls that hold the hillside in place, the foundations cut from the hill's own rock. Around 1909, a different kind of labor arrived. Japanese gardeners and carpenters, identified in estate records as Ueda and Takahashi, were brought to Pocantico Hills specifically to design and construct Japanese garden structures. Not from Westchester, not from New York, from Japan. The Rockefeller estate had the resources to source specialized labor from anywhere on Earth, and it did. The gardens at Kaikouet were not the product of one community or one tradition. They were assembled from the world. Construction, however, was a finite project. What followed was not. The greenhouse documentation's reference to hundreds of workers describes not a building phase but a permanent operating condition. Kaikouet was not a house that simply existed, it was a system that had to be continuously run, and running it required a workforce of considerable scale and specialization. The greenhouse complex alone demanded horticultural staff who understood how to keep imported ornamental orange trees alive through New York winters, trees that had no business surviving in Westchester County and survived only because trained workers managed their environment with precision year-round. Fresh flowers were delivered from the estate to Rockefeller residences on a regular schedule. This was not a hobby. It was a supply operation, and it required people who knew exactly what they were doing. The formal gardens, Bosworth's terraces, the geometric patterns, the precisely shaped hedges, the fountains, required continuous maintenance to remain what they were. A formal garden left alone for Sati. A season does not stay formal, it becomes something else. The perfection visible in period photographs existed because workers arrived every morning and made it exist again. Farm laborers maintained the estate's agricultural operations. Craftsmen handled the ongoing repair and upkeep of structures that, at Kaikouet's scale, were always in need of something. Chauffeurs managed the automobile fleet after the coach barn was adapted in 1907. And inside the house itself, the full hierarchy of domestic service operated from before dawn until after the family retired. The indoor staff at Kaikouet is not documented publicly with the specificity historians would prefer. Exact headcounts are not available. Individual wage records have not entered the public archive. But the structure of a household at this scale in this era is well understood from comparable estates. At the top of the male indoor hierarchy, the butler, who managed the dining room, supervised the footman, controlled the wine cellar, and coordinated the formal presentation of the household to guests. Below him, footmen, formally dressed, present at meals and formal occasions, invisible the rest of the time. The housekeeper governed the female staff, ladies' maids who attended personally to the women of the family, housemaids who cleaned the rooms before the family came downstairs, kitchen maids who prepared food under the direction of the head cook, laundresses who managed the enormous volume of household linen, scullery maids who handled the work that happened furthest from view. Each role carried a specific expectation that went beyond the task itself. You were present when summoned, you were absent when not. You did not make noise that traveled. You did not occupy spaces designated for the family. You were, to the greatest extent the architecture allowed, not quite there. And the architecture allowed quite a lot. The 1911 to 1913 reconstruction of Kaikwit II into Kaikwit III involved significant structural intervention, floors removed, a new story added, the main facade relocated. Among the additions documented in the HABS records was a delivery tunnel cut beneath the terraces. Consider what this decision represents. The house was already standing. The terraces were already designed. Engineers and architects were on site for major structural work, and someone in the middle of all of that specified that a tunnel should be excavated beneath the landscape so that deliveries could reach the kitchen without crossing the family's line of sight. Coal, ice, groceries, laundry. The physical material of daily life in a large household, all of it rerouted underground, invisible from above, so that the surface of Kaikwet could remain what it was designed to appear, a serene classical composition where nothing as crude as logistics ever intruded. This was not an efficiency measure. Existing doors existed. This was a design philosophy made literal in excavated rock. The working world and the living world should never visually intersect. Labor was necessary. Absolutely entirely necessary, the estate could not function for a single day without it, but it should not be seen performing that necessity. Build the tunnel. Solve the problem. The Annunciator system completed what the tunnel began. HABS documentation records that the 1911 to 1913 works included the installation of power, light, and signals throughout Kaikwit, the coach barn, and the gardens. Signals meant annunciator boards, numbered displays in the servants' areas corresponding to specific rooms in the house, each connected to a pull cord or button that a family member could activate without leaving their chair. The sequence this enabled: a family member presses a button. Somewhere below or behind the walls, an indicator flips. A worker checks the board, identifies the room, proceeds there, performs the required service, and withdraws. No shouting across rooms, no staff wandering through family spaces, no accidental encounters, no informal moments, no blurring of the line between the world above stairs and the world below. The Annunciator system was not technology, it was social architecture, hierarchy encoded into wiring and brass indicators, making the management of human beings as frictionless and invisible as the management of temperature or light. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, John D. Rockefeller Jr. sponsored additional construction projects at Pocantico, a new stable, infrastructure improvements, local school work. These projects were explicitly described at the time as job creation, a means of providing wages to local workers during years of severe economic contraction. This framing was not dishonest. Workers were hired, wages were paid, the need was real, but the estate also genuinely required the work being done, and the Rockefeller family could afford to commission it regardless of economic conditions. What the Depression provided was a moment in which self-interest and benefaction pointed in exactly the same direction, and the benefaction was emphasized in the public accounting while the self-interest remained quietly in the background. It was the 1895 school all over again. Genuine help, strategically timed, impeccably framed. Today, the guided tour at Kaikwit moves through the family rooms, the formal gardens, the coach barn galleries, the Nelson Rockefeller sculpture collection. It is a carefully constructed experience, and it is genuinely impressive. The house is beautiful. The terraces are extraordinary. The Hudson Valley view from the upper gardens is among the finest in the northeastern United States. The tour does not go through the service tunnel. This is not an oversight. The tunnel's existence is documented. Its location is known. It is a choice. The same choice that was made when the tunnel was built, that the working infrastructure of this place should remain below the surface of the experience being offered. The stone is still there. The tunnel is still there. And somewhere in a government archive, in language that does not know how to be dramatic, a single line records that hundreds of workers came here every day to make one family's life run smoothly. They are the reason any of this still stands. By 1908, the work was done. The architects had delivered, the contractors had built. Nearly $1 million had moved from the Rockefeller accounts into stone and timber and formal gardens and a coach barn that had cost almost double its original estimate. William Wells, Bosworth's terraces were taking shape. Ogden Codman had sourced furnishings from London and Paris. The Thompson Starrett Company had completed what Delano and Aldrich had designed. John D. Rockefeller Sr. moved into Kykuit too, looked at what $1 million and years of planning had produced, and found it wanting. Too dark, awkward, not right. Within 2 years, the architects were recalled. The top floors came off. A new story went up. The facade was moved forward. A tunnel was cut beneath the terraces. The plumbing and electrical systems were overhauled, and the house that emerged from this second round of construction, Kykuit III, completed in 1913, was presented to the world as a model of classical restraint, as if it had arrived at its current form through calm deliberation rather than through a decade of disagreement, 2 complete construction campaigns, and a level of expenditure that would have been the defining financial event of almost any other American family's history. The restraint was real. The calm was not. To understand what actually drove this project, you have to understand that Kykuit was never one man's vision. It was the product of a collision between 2 men with fundamentally different problems, a father and a son who both needed this house to do something, but needed it to do entirely different things. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was, by every credible account, genuinely frugal, not as performance, not as public positioning. The personal account ledger he kept from his teenage years through the end of his long life, recording income and expenditure with the precision of a professional bookkeeper, is one of the most revealing documents in American business history. He tithed from his first salary. He tracked small purchases. He found waste genuinely offensive in the way that people raised in material modesty often do, regardless of how far their circumstances later travel from that origin. He was a devout Baptist. He did not drink. He was uncomfortable with the kind of conspicuous display that characterized the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the other great houses of the Gilded Age. When he described what he wanted at Pocantico Hills, the word he reached for was simple and dignified. A house that reflected his actual character rather than the caricature the newspapers had built around his name. The difficulty, and it was a structural difficulty, not a personal failing, was that simplicity at his scale had become a kind of impossibility. A man with $900 million cannot build a simple house. He can build a house that looks simple, which requires entirely different things. Architects hired specifically to restrain grandeur, decorators sourced from the Aesosan, most sophisticated rooms in Europe to project inherited taste rather than purchased taste, landscape designers of international reputation to make the grounds appear as though nature had arranged them without assistance. The performance of simplicity, at that scale, costs more than straightforward extravagance would have. Rockefeller Sr. wanted a house that did not look like what his money was. What he got was a house that demonstrated, in every careful detail, exactly how much money it had taken to not look like it. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a different man with a different inheritance and a different fear. He had not built the Standard Oil empire. He had been born into the consequences of it, the name, the fortune, the scrutiny, and the accumulated public hostility that Ida Tarbell's reporting had crystallized and intensified. He was Harvard-educated, genuinely drawn to European architecture and formal culture, more comfortable in the vocabulary of Beaux-Arts refinement than in the oil fields and railroad offices where the family money had originated. His anxiety was not about looking ostentatious. His anxiety was about looking insufficient. John Jr. understood that Kaikwit would be measured against a specific set of comparisons: the Vanderbilt houses, the Astor estates, the great country houses that the American elite had constructed across the Hudson Valley and Long Island and Newport. If Kaikwit fell short of those benchmarks, if it read as modest, apologetic, or in any way smaller than the Rockefeller name warranted, that gap would register publicly. It would suggest that the family, for all their wealth, lacked something. Taste, perhaps, confidence, the easy relationship with grandeur that old money was supposed to carry as naturally as a surname. What John Jr. was actually trying to solve was a legitimacy problem, the puerin chithiat. Rockefeller fortune was the largest in American history, but it was also the most publicly contested. Standard Oil had been dissected in print, hauled before congressional committees, and ultimately broken apart by Supreme Court order. The money existed. Whether it had been earned in a way that entitled the family to the social position that money was supposed to buy, that was the question that followed the name everywhere. Architecture was one answer to that question, a house that stood alongside the great houses of the era that employed the finest architects and decorators and landscape designers, that projected culture and permanence and taste. Such a house argued in the most durable medium available that the Rockefellers belonged, not among the industrialists, among the civilized. Between these two men and their irreconcilable needs, the three-version history of Kaikwit makes a different kind of sense. Kaikwit I was the farmhouse that already existed when Rockefeller bought the land in 1893, the Gothic-style Parsons-Wentworth structure that satisfied no one's ambitions but served well enough until the 1902 fire made the question unavoidable. Kaikwit II was John Jr.'s first serious attempt to answer that question. Delano and Aldrich brought in, a design developed, the Thompson-Starrett Company contracted in 1906, construction substantially complete by 1908. The coach barn finished at more than $135,000. The orangery commissioned to house imported French orange trees. The greenhouses ordered from Lord and Burnham. And then the family moved in, and Rockefeller Sr. found the rooms too dark and the circulation awkward and the whole thing somehow not what he had asked for. Whether his dissatisfaction was genuinely about the architecture or about something harder to name, some feeling that the house had become, in John Jr.'s hands, more of a statement than a home, the records do not say clearly. What the records show is the response. In 1910 and 1911, architects were recalled and a second reconstruction was ordered that was, in scope and cost, essentially a new building project dressed as renovation. Kaikwit III emerged in 1913. The facade that reads as classical restraint was rebuilt from a house that did not satisfy. The terraces that appear inevitable were redesigned after the first version was rejected. The service tunnel that runs beneath them was a specific, deliberate decision made during the reconstruction to ensure that the physical evidence of the household's operation would remain permanently out of sight. Then came Nelson. John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s son, Sr.'s grandson, inherited Kaikwit as his principal residence in 1960. By that point, he was governor of New York, a position he would hold through 1973, and a man for whom the management of image was not a family anxiety but a professional discipline. Nelson Rockefeller was a modern art collector of serious commitment. His mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, had been among the founders of the Museum of Modern Art, and the institution carried deep family identification. When Nelson took up residence at Curated, he brought that sensibility with him in a literal sense. Large-scale sculptures by Pablo Picasso, Alexander Calder, Henry Moore, and Alberto Giacometti were installed across Bosworth's classical terraces. The visual effect was striking and deliberate. Abstract modernism placed in conversation with Beaux-Arts landscape design, 20th century art occupying a 19th century formal garden. The message this combination sent was specific. The Rockefellers were not custodians of inherited tradition. They were active participants in living culture. Under Nelson, Curated also became something Rockefeller Sr. had specifically not wanted it to be: a stage. Governors, diplomats, cultural figures, and political allies moved through the house and gardens in a carefully managed hospitality that served Nelson's political ambitions as directly as his Chase Manhattan board meetings did. The private refuge that Sr. had envisioned, the dynastic statement that Jr. had constructed, became in Nelson's hands a venue for influence, a place where access itself was the currency being exchanged. His final act regarding Curated was characteristically large in scale. In his will, Nelson left the core estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The private fortress would become public legacy. The Rockefeller name would be permanently attached not to monopoly and antitrust proceedings, but to cultural stewardship and historic preservation. It was the same conversion that had driven the entire project from the beginning. Contested wealth translated into something that looked from the right angle, like virtue. 3 generations, 3 distinct anxieties. One house rebuilt twice to contain them. What is remarkable, looking across the full arc of this story, is that none of it resolved the underlying tension. Sr. wanted simplicity and spent $1 million failing to achieve it. Jr. wanted legitimacy and built a house that the Supreme Court's antitrust ruling would always shadow. Nelson wanted legacy and created an institution that, by opening to the public, invited exactly the scrutiny the family had spent a century trying to manage. The walls are still there, the terraces are still there, the view over the Tappan Zee is still there, and the question that drove every stone of this place, whether extreme wealth can be converted into something that looks like it was deserved, is still, in the most polite and beautiful way imaginable, unanswered. Curated did not have a public entrance. This is not a figure of speech or a metaphor about exclusivity, it is a physical fact. The roads that wound through the Rockefeller estate at Pocantico Hills were private roads, built and maintained by the family, appearing on no public map. The 3,000 acres that surrounded the house were not parkland open to neighboring communities. They were a controlled perimeter. To reach the front door of Curated, you needed to be brought there, invited, collected, escorted through a landscape that had been specifically engineered to make the outside world feel very far away. For the first 80 years of the estate's existence, almost no one was. The social function of a great house is rarely discussed in the same breath as its architecture, but the two are inseparable. A house at Curated scale is not built to be lived in quietly. It is built to be witnessed by a specific audience under specific conditions at specific moments chosen by the key family rather than by anyone else. The rooms, the gardens, the terraces, the carefully framed views, all of it is theater, and theater requires an audience. The question is always who gets a seat. At Curated, the answer was controlled with the same precision that Rockefeller Sr. had once applied to oil refining. The estate served, across its decades of private use, as a setting for conversations that could not happen in offices or clubs or hotel dining rooms, conversations where the physical environment itself communicated something important before anyone spoke. When John D. Rockefeller Jr. hosted a philanthropic discussion at Curated, the surroundings argued on his behalf. This family has taste, this family has permanence, this family is the kind of institution that foundations and universities should want as a partner. When Nelson Rockefeller received political allies on the terraces where Picasso sculptures stood among Bosworth's classical hedges, the environment communicated an entire political identity without requiring a single policy statement. This is what great houses have always done. They are not passive backdrops, they are active arguments, and Curated was one of the most carefully constructed arguments in American architectural history. The guest list at Curated across the estate's decades of private use was never large and never random. It was curated. Politicians came. During Nelson Rockefeller's tenure as New York governor through 1973 and during his time as U.S. vice president under Gerald Ford from 1974 to 1977, Curated functioned as an extension of official hospitality. A place for conversations that formal state settings could not provide, where relationships could be built away from the press and the public calendar. Cultural figures came. The Rockefeller family's deep involvement with American institutions, the Museum of Modern Art, Rockefeller University, Colonial Williamsburg, Lincoln Center, meant that artists, academics, architects, and institutional leaders moved through Curated across multiple generations. These were not purely social visits. They were the maintenance of a network that extended Rockefeller influence into every significant cultural institution in the country. Business figures came. The family's financial interests, centered on Chase Manhattan Bank under David Rockefeller's leadership through the 1960s and 1970s, required the kind of cultivation that Curated's particular quality of hospitality provided, not just resources, but a house that had stood long enough to feel permanent. What these visits shared was not their subject matter. They shared their terms. The Rockefellers set them. The guests accepted them. Access to Curated was itself a form of recognition. Among the most frequently cited stories associated with Curated is the claim that the idea for the Museum of Modern Art was first discussed in the house's drawing room. The precise historical record on this point is soft. The story has circulated widely enough to qualify as institutional legend rather than documented fact. What is documented is that Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was among MoMA's 3 founding patrons when the museum opened in 1929. Her role was central. Her influence on the institution's early direction was substantial. Whether the drawing room conversation happened exactly as the legend describes is uncertain. That Curated's social environment was the context in which Rockefeller cultural philanthropy was planned and coordinated is not uncertain at all. In December 1991, the theater came to a quiet close. Before the estate's formal handover to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the extended Rockefeller family gathered at Curated for a final private dinner. Contemporary accounts describe it as bittersweet. The family moving through rooms that had held 4 generations of private life, aware that this particular version of Curated was ending. 2 weeks later, the estate was formally entrusted to the National Trust. In 1994, public tours began. The media coverage compared the public interest to that surrounding Buckingham Palace tours. The comparison was more revealing than the coverage recognized. Curated generated that interest for exactly the same reason Buckingham Palace does, because the life conducted inside it had been so deliberately protected from outside view for so long. The gates opened, the tour route was designed. The narrative was curated, and the story that Curated would tell its visitors was shaped, as it had always been, by the family whose name was still on the building. The public entrance that had now exists. There is a parking area, there are ticketed tours, there are guides who walk visitors through rooms that governors and diplomats once moved through by private invitation. But the service tunnel is not on the tour. The Standard Oil history is mentioned briefly. The hundreds of workers who sustain this place across half a century do not have a dedicated room. The gatekeepers of Pocantico have changed. The gates, in certain important respects, have not. There are two ways to walk through Caiquet. The first follows the guided route: the architecture, the gardens, the modern sculpture, the philanthropic legacy. It is a genuinely impressive walk. The house is beautiful. The Bosworth terraces are among the finest formal garden compositions in the United States. Nelson Rockefeller's sculpture collection, Picasso and Calder and Moore positioned against the Hudson Valley sky, is extraordinary by any measure. Time equals, quote, 0.8 seconds, quote, / greater than the guided walk gives you all of this, and it is not dishonest. Everything it shows you is real. The second walk traces the money backward. It starts at the same terraces and follows the funding, through the construction accounts, through the Standard Oil rebate agreements, through the railroad manipulation and the price wars, and the systematic absorption of competitors who had no leverage against a company that had already bought the infrastructure everyone needed. It follows Ida Tarbell's 19-part documentation of what that system actually was and how it actually operated. It ends not in Westchester County, but in the Pennsylvania oil fields and the Cleveland refineries and the small businesses that did not survive the Anaconda method. Caiquet was designed to make the second walk difficult to take. Not impossible, the history exists, the records are available, the Supreme Court ruling is a matter of public record. But difficult. The beauty is not incidental to this difficulty. The beauty is the mechanism. A house this serene, this classical, this permanent feeling creates a powerful gravitational pull toward the first walk and away from the second. This is not unique to Caiquet. It is what great houses have always done. They aestheticize the conditions of their own creation. They convert the uncomfortable origins of extreme wealth into landscape and architecture and art, and then they invite you to experience the conversion rather than examine it. What makes Caiquet's version worth examining is its precision. The deliberateness with which each design decision served the same underlying function, to place distance between what this family was and what this house argued they were. Rockefeller Sr.'s insistence on restraint, the classical facade, the understated stone, the refusal of obvious gilded excess, was not ipsum modesty. It was strategy. Gilded excess would have confirmed the robber baron narrative. Restraint argued against it. Every choice that made the house look less than what the fortune could have bought was a choice that made the fortune harder to examine. John Jr.'s campaign to associate the family with culture, the Beaux-Arts architects, the Ogden-Codman interiors, the Bosworth gardens, performed the same function through different means. You do not think about railroad rebates when you are standing in a room furnished by the co-author of The Decoration of Houses. The beauty does its work quietly, without asking permission. Nelson's sculpture garden took this logic to its most sophisticated conclusion. By installing Picasso and Calder and Moore in the terraces, he placed the Rockefeller name inside the story of 20th century art rather than inside the story of 20th century monopoly. The reframing was total, the setting was permanent. The labor question sits beneath all of this in the same way the service tunnel sits beneath the terraces. Hundreds of workers sustained Caiquet across half a century. Italian immigrant masons built its walls. Japanese craftsmen shaped its garden structures. An army of domestic staff maintained its surfaces and supplied its rooms and moved through its corridors on the understanding that they would not be seen doing so. The delivery tunnel was not incidental to Caiquet's design. It was essential to it. A house that asks you to believe in effortless elegance cannot afford visible logistics. The elegance and the invisibility were the same project. The annunciator system extended this logic into daily life. Labor summoned electronically, labor dismissed electronically, labor present without presence. The architecture did not hide the workers by accident. It hid them by design. The marble does not lie. It simply does not speak about everything. What the guided tour tells you about Kikwit is true. The architecture is significant. The gardens are extraordinary. The art collection is genuinely important. The Rockefeller philanthropic record, the foundations, the universities, the cultural institutions, represents a real and substantial contribution to American public life. None of that is false. All of it is incomplete. The things the marble leaves out, the Standard Oil system, the labor it took to run this place, the land consolidated from families who sold without knowing the full picture, the service tunnel that routes the working world away from the living world, those things are not footnotes. They are the foundation. The house sits on them the way it sits on the hill, and the hill, as the engineering records quietly note, was quarried to build the walls that now stand on top of it. What was removed became the structure. That is still true. It has always been true. And it is, in the end, the only fact about Kikwit that the marble cannot cover. In 2026, the tours at Kikwit are suspended. Historic Hudson Valley, which has operated public access to the estate since 1994, is stepping back. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund is expected to assume direct management of visitor operations going forward. The precise shape of what comes next has not been publicly announced. The gates are not permanently closed, but who holds the key and what story they will tell when the tours resume is once again being decided in private. This is, in a quiet way, entirely consistent with how Kikwit has always worked. The 1994 opening was genuinely significant. For the first time in the estate's century-long history, a person without a Rockefeller invitation could walk the Bosworth terraces, stand in the rooms where governors had dined, look out over the Tappan Zee from the upper garden. The media coverage compared public interest to Buckingham Palace tours. Visitors came in substantial numbers. The house that had been closed for so long was finally, partially, open. But the tour route was curated from the beginning. The narrative emphasized architecture, the formal gardens, the Nelson Rockefeller art collection, and the family's philanthropic contributions to American cultural life. These are all real. None of them are the complete story. The Standard Oil history appeared at the edges. The labor of hundreds of workers who sustained the estate across half a century did not have a room. The service tunnel remained below the surface of the visitor experience as it had always remained below the surface of the family's daily life. A heritage site operated in close partnership with the family foundation it memorializes is structurally constrained in the critiques it can offer. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply the logic of the arrangement. There is a version of Kikwit's story that the tours have always told well. The architecture is significant and the house genuinely merits serious attention. The Bosworth Gardens are among the finest formal landscape compositions in the northeastern United States. Nelson Rockefeller's sculpture program, Picasso, Calder, Moore, Giacometti installed across classical terraces, is an extraordinary achievement by any measure, and it is presented with genuine care. The Rockefeller philanthropic record is real. The foundations, the universities, the cultural institutions, these are not myths. They represent a substantial and lasting contribution to American public life, and the tours acknowledge them honestly. None of that changes what the tours have been slower to say, that the fortune behind all of it was built through a system the Supreme Court ruled illegal, that hundreds of workers sustained this estate for decades and left almost no trace in the public record. that the land was assembled quietly from families who sold without knowing the full picture, that the service tunnel, the physical embodiment of a philosophy about whose labor should be visible and whose should not, is not on the route. These are not accusations, they are facts, and a site that presents itself as a place of historical education has, eventually, to find a way to present them. What Curated is still deciding, in 2026, in the quiet interval between one management regime and the next, is what version of itself it wants to present to the people who will eventually walk through it again. The internet has already changed the terms of that decision. Visitors who arrive at Curated today, whenever the tours resume, do not arrive without context. They have read about Standard Oil, they have encountered Ida Tarbell, they have seen documentaries that connect the mansion's beauty to the monopoly that paid for it. The building can no longer control its own frame in the way it once could. The second walk, the one that traces the money backward, is now taken by many visitors before they even reach the parking area. What the site chooses to do with that reality is the most interesting question Curated currently faces. The stone will not change. The terraces will not change. The Hudson Valley view that made Rockefeller buy this hill in 1893 will not change. But the story told inside those walls is a choice. It has always been a choice, and the most honest thing that could happen when the gates reopen is for that choice to be made differently than it has been made before. To follow the money all the way back, to name the workers, to walk the service tunnel as part of the route rather than beneath it. Curated was built from its own excavation. The hill was quarried to build the house that sits on it. What was removed became the foundation. That is still true, and it is, in the end, the only introduction this place ever needed.